Riley, you should be able to, everybody should be able to hear me. Actually, if you can confirm real quick. Riley, you should be able to. There we go. All right, everybody. We have audio now.
Good job, Omar.
Awesome. Sorry about that, folks. So I want to be respectful for everybody's time, and I'm actually gonna get started right now. I'm gonna introduce Lee. It's our first workshop of the day. We have a day full of material here today, and his presentation is around how to build a holistic cyber range using a graphic network simulator, JNS3, and exploiting layer 3 and beyond. It's actually a lab. It's a hands-on workshop. I hope you have fun, and I pass it back to Lee.
Thank you, Omar, so much. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. Sorry, we had a little technical difficulties getting started. I hope everybody can hear now. A couple things right up front. We're streaming on all different kinds of things, the Red Team channel and Twitch and YouTube. I can see it up here to my right. We also have a Discord channel, and if anybody has any questions, I'm going to run through this workshop lab today, and then we will take some time at the very end. I'll hang around in Discord on the Red Team channel, Discord channel. Underneath the Red Team trainings, there is a folder channel for this class. So if anybody wants to pop in there and has any questions. If you didn't get from either any of the posts or pre-shared information, the setup instructions, you can just play along, follow along, and then I'll provide a link at the end of this so that you can gather all the information for this course. So welcome. My name, as I said, is Lee McWhorter. I'm the CTO of Coverage 6. We're a unique veteran-owned, veteran-focused security company. We offer training, services, and products in all areas of security, from physical security, executive protection, cybersecurity, obviously, and even technical security integration. We are CompTIA partners, and I'm on the CompTIA board for the CompTIA Instructor Network. As you can see, I have a bunch of certs, but that's not the point today. I've been doing this for a long time. What we're going to do today is this is a Red Team Village workshop to talk about how to build your own cyber range. And so I promise there's only a handful of slides in this entire thing. I'm going to get straight into doing some hands-on demos and introducing you folks to GNS3 and building your own labs and really be getting down into customizing them to a degree. There is a small agenda. We're going to overview GNS3 for those who aren't familiar with it. We're going to talk about different types of appliances we can use to build out our own cyber ranges, and we're going to set up one together. And one of the things, like I said, at the very end, there'll be a slide, and I'll make a lot of, ding, 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 pay attention to this slide, get this URL, take a picture or whatever. It's a link that I have up in my Google Drive that will allow you to get these slides, to get setup instructions if you didn't already, even to get a link to the video, which I assume will be recorded and posted on our channel for later. And so all of that, and then even the range I'm going to build. So if you weren't pre-set up to play along and you're following along today, then you can actually download that file and play with it yourself later. So the first thing that I wanted to just have a little fun with, I know from doing this workshop for Red Team Village now for a number of different events, including DEF CON last year, Safe Mode, as well as GrayHat. I'm supporting my Red Team Village from the last live DEF CON when I was volunteering with them, but I know that there are some issues with GNS3. So before we dive in too deep, I'm going to just cover some of these really quickly for you folks, because if you can't get GNS3 set up and running, then it kind of defeats the whole purpose of being able to use it. Now, so at a very high level, GNS3, and I'll give you a deep dive in a minute, but is a graphic network simulator, as its name implies. It allows us to build virtual emulated networks, and everything really works. That's the real beauty of it. That's the cool part. And so what you want to be able to do, though, is it's a multi-part system. There is a GUI piece of software, and then it has a little, what they call a local server, which is sort of the glue piece, the middleware piece. And then there's a VM, a virtual machine, that's actually the custom GNS3 VM. And so you have to make sure everything works. So if you're having trouble either before this class trying to set up or after watching this, if you're having some issues, these are some of the common things. The first thing is just make sure the VM runs. Make sure that you can launch the virtual machine in and of itself without even worrying about GNS3 software. If the VM is throwing errors about not having kernel virtual machine support, you may have to check your BIOS, or you may have to use this line here in BIA2, little eyes, that says VBox manage modify the VM to turn on hardware virtualization. If you can get the VM running, then the other things to make sure is that you have your setup right. When you set up the software and run through the installation, you have that choice for what's called host binding. And sometimes it will default to your current IP instead of the loopback address. If you use your current IP and your IP changes, then of course that's going to cause problems later. So loopback's better. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're running into some trouble with regard to getting GNS3 set up, you can see, and it's in here a couple other places too, but lee.grayhat is my email address I created for the GrayHat last year, and continue to use it here. And I like the name anyway, but drop me an email and I'll happily try to help you get that all set up and running. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to learn a little bit about GNS3, Graphic Network Simulator 3. And we're going to talk about its environment and even just a little bit about the VM and some tricks related to that. Excuse me. We're going to then talk about the appliances, because what we can do in GNS3 is literally build networks that have working routers and switches and targets and scanning machines and anything we want, really. And so we're going to look at how to work with the standard GNS3 appliances. We're going to talk about how to add other types of appliances, including Docker images and other virtual machines, into the GNS3 environment. And then we're also going to then build a range together. Take you through how to build a simple range. I'll show you a little bit more complex one that we use in our cybersecurity program at Cover 6 a little later. But we'll talk about all the different types of applications you can add: attack and scanning apps, vulnerable targets, router switches, monitoring appliances. And this allows you to really build out a range that you can play in. And like I said, we use one in our program as part of teaching students. So for the moment, that's all the slides I have. We'll come back to the slide deck a little later. I'm going to get out of that for just a second and minimize and just get to my desktop. And what we're going to do is I'm going to just slowly walk you through all of this. Now, the setup instructions I see were just posted in the YouTube channel. I'll throw them in Discord later. Like I said, there's a link at the end of this presentation for a summary document that has everything, the slides and setup instructions, etc. And I'll ultimately share the topology that I built out there as well. And so what we're going to do is just pretty much dive into it. And I'm going to just, if you have played along and you've set everything up correctly, then when you finish, you're going to have installed VirtualBox. I guess just to go through the quick install, if anybody's trying to rapidly race along, you need to get the VirtualBox or some kind of virtualization software. VMware, for example, will work as well. The instructions that I provide use VirtualBox just because it's open source and free everywhere, including on Mac. So you should be able to do this exercise anywhere. You can absolutely do it with other, with VMware if you want to. And so you're going to download and have some kind of virtualization software. I recommend VirtualBox, and then the extension pack that comes with it to add some extra functionality. And then you're going to have to go to the GNS3 site and download the GNS3 software and the already pre-built GNS3 VM. And you'll want to first import that VM into VirtualBox. At that point, the VM is in there and it would run. Like I said, if you're having issues, you can launch it just like any other VM and check it out separately to get things working. Once that's working and you then install the GNS3 software, as part of that setup, you have to choose, I'm using VirtualBox or VMware. You have to choose that host address. And ideally, everything then connects together and works. Like I said, if you are having any problems getting it all set up, please don't hesitate. Drop me every time I do a class like this for CompTIA or for 18 Village or whoever. I always tell students, please just drop me an email and I'll happily try to help you out and answer questions about that. Or even if somebody's watching this, 6 months from now and watching the video in our playlist and has some questions, don't hesitate to drop me an email. I'm always happy to help people learn how to do this, especially if they're working their way into learning more and more about cybersecurity. So once it's all set up, you'll notice that I have VirtualBox over here, and then I have this little gecko icon, which is GNS3. And so assuming, and that's what we're going to do, I'll help you offline if I need to, but assuming you've got this set up or you've installed it all and everything's working well, then the only thing you have to do is just launch GNS3. it pops a little DOS box or a command prompt. You can tell how old I am by that statement. And then it brings up the GUI for the GNS3 software. Now, we're going to do most of our work here, but this is not quite ready. Just because this has come up doesn't quite mean that we're ready to work. Matter of fact, now here comes the next part. You see it says connecting to server 127001. That's the local server, that little middleware piece. That is going to basically then, and we can see it down here, it's happening automatically. It's going to kick up VirtualBox in my case and begin to boot up the GNS3 VM. The beauty of this, once it's all working, a little bit of setup sometimes can be a hassle. Once you have it all working, it's so nice. You just launch the software, it sets up everything it needs to, and then when we're done at the end, we kill it, it'll go ahead and shut down that VM for us and take care of that. What we're waiting for is for that VM, and I'm going to bring it up front, not that we ever really have to mess with it, but you can see it's just an Ubuntu VM, and it's going to boot up to its own little splash screen here, and you can tell what we're looking for, and this is one of those things I mentioned in that troubleshooting slide, is if it doesn't say KVM support true, that's going to be a problem for you. So you're going to need to make sure that you check your BIOS, that you have all the advanced virtualization features on, and you're going to make sure everything is working at that point. Generally, the only thing, occasionally there is a menu system for this VM. There are a few tricks. You can even upload things into it. I talked a little bit more about that in detail in the advanced version of this class I've done for GrayHat in the past. And so, but there are some tricks to it, but generally you don't really have to use the VM. It's where all the magic happens. We're basically running virtual machines inside of this virtual machine. So everything we build in GNS3, every router we have, every unit we build is all going to live back in this VM. And that's where all the magic happens. And so that's why all of this has to work and talk to each other. Generally, though, you can just leave the VM minimized in the background. That is just sitting back there to store all of our work. And so then when you're up and running, this is generally what you're going to see. I've turned on the server summaries over here on the side. You can see the 2 green dots for my desktop and for the GNS3 VM. That's under the view menu. I'll take you through a tour here in just a second. But this is what it'll come up when you first launch it every time. It will basically bring up, if everything works appropriately, the VM should be running in the background. And then you should have this, new project or open project dialog box to get going. Now, for the moment, I'm just going to cancel that because I want to give you a quick tour of GNS3. Now, it's funny because there's all of these buttons and button bars and menu bars and everything else. But in all honesty, I use very few of these things. But let's just go through a quick little tour. So under the file menu, obviously, we can create a new project. We can open an existing project. And I do want to point out here, this import portable project. It's one of my favorite parts of GNS3. Once you get into it and you've built yourself a range, you can actually export that and give it to your friends. Or, if you're a teacher, you could build like I do. You can build them for classes and then give them to your students. Or you'll find out on the GNS3 site, out there, in the forums, other people may have shared one of their own. Like I said, at the end of this, the one that I built for us today, we will end up, I'll share that with you. So you could, if you are just watching this and you want to play with it later, you can download that pre-built virtual machine and be able to, to import it in. There are probably the most important menu occasionally is the edit preferences menu. We'll come back to this briefly on a couple things, but this is if you are running into some trouble or you're having to do more advanced things like add true virtual machines in, then you might need to come in here and work with the settings on this situation within the setup. And if you are, like we mentioned on the support slide again, if you're having trouble connecting and the VM's not automatically launching, it's not working, you might want to come in here and make sure your host binding is on 127.0.0.1. And then under the VM itself setting, you want to make sure it's on and you have the appropriate virtualization, and the drop down here matches the name of the GNS3 VM. It should just be GNS3 space VM. But depending on what VMs you have and what choice you made on the installation, maybe even a misclick could have caused that not to match up. And then, also under the view menu is where you can go down here to these docs and you can turn on or off whether you want those summaries on the side. I like to have that server summary up because if I don't see those 2 green dots, I know something's not working in my setup, and I'm going to have to basically, fix that before I can go on and play. Now, the rest of the things that happen are all down this left-hand side. These are just shortcuts to menus start and stop appliances. We'll come back to some of this. I really don't really use much of this. And even on this left side, you can see it says browse routers, browse switches, browse end devices, and security devices. And then second to the last button, it says browse all devices. Well, these two buttons right here, browse all devices and the add a link button, are probably the two I use the most. And that's because I just want to be able to see everything. Now, if you add hundreds of appliances in, then these sub buttons may come in handy. In our case, we're going to start with a pretty basic set. And so I generally just turn on and off the devices when I need to see them. Now you'll see that this is pretty much what you should be seeing if you did set up everything up and follow along. You'll see that it comes with a handful of switches and hubs and then a virtual PC. And that's about all that GNS3 has out of the box. And while that will let you build, as I'm going to show you here in a second, a small little network, that's only the sort of first step. We're going to go through how to add a whole lot more appliances. So, but to show you how it works and to get into some of the most basic functionality of GNS3, let me just do this. I'm going to do File and then New Project. And once again, we're back to this screen as it came up when we booted up the system. And so I'm just going to call this one Red Team Village. If I can type today, let me see. Oops. And just call it a project so that way I create a brand new project within the system. You can call yours anything you want to, of course. And you'll see all it does is give me this blank white space. So what are we doing here, Lee? Well, what we're doing is we're going to build a very simple network. And I'm going to start with nothing but the default devices. And actually, I'm going to throw this together real fast, show you how to do it, and then we'll do it because it's way too simple. We're going to build more complex things. But we'll start with this Ethernet switch. And even this stuff, this very basic stuff, hits a bunch of important points along the way. So what are we going to do? Well, we're just going to take one of these, click and drag on it, and we're going to drag. You see, I've literally picked up this little switch, so I can drop it into my workspace here. When I do that, one of the most important things pops up. One of the just rules of thumb, rules of GNS3. Many times when you add a device into your setup, it's going to ask you this question: what server do you want to run that on? If we look at that right now, it's telling me it wants to, it's selecting my desktop. And I'm going to tell you right now, the rule is always run stuff in the GNS3 VM. So you see when I drop that down, oh, there's a choice there, GNS3 VM. The reason is we want to run all of our nodes, all of our pieces in the VM, because if they're not living back there and thus running VMs inside of a VM, they can't talk to each other. Now, why is there a choice? Well, I'll be honest, there are ways to connect a completely virtual GNS3 network to the real world. There are ways to connect to, say, like if you go work someplace and they're using GNS3 within their corporate environment to sort of map and mirror their own network, they may have a corporate server somewhere that you're going to connect to so everybody can share projects and files and appliances. But in our case, the way the instructions have you set it up, standalone on your own computer, and if that's the way you're doing it to teach yourself and learn, you're going to always choose to run it in the GNS3 VM. If you don't, then if you put some things in the VM and some things on your computer, then they won't be able to talk to each other. So the general rule of thumb, unless for some particular reason like a corporate environment, you're always going to put things in the GNS3 VM, take the GNS3 server default. So I'm going to click OK, and you're going to see it literally, if you're playing along, you've got yourself a switch in here. We can pick it up, drag it, move it around. If you mouse over it just for a second, you'll see it pops up some information, including that this is an 8-port switch from Ethernet 0 through 7. We can double click on the name and we can change it if we want to. That's pretty easy stuff. Okay, so we got a switch. Great. So what else are we going to do? Well, let's add something else to it. Let's add one of these little virtual PCs. So I'm going to drop me a virtual PC in here. Once again, same thing. Always choose the GNS3 VM. So we're going to choose that. All right, cool. Pick that in, drop in one of those. Let's go ahead and drop 2. Not much of a network without at least 2 devices, right? So we're going to drop another one. Once again, put it in the GNS3 VM. And then we're going to put that in. And now at this point, we have a little bitty network here with 2 PCs and 1 switch, but nothing's wired up. So we're going to have to come over here and use this add a link button. It's basically just virtual cabling, guys. That's all it is. So if we click on this, it changes our cursor to this little plus sign. And now if we go and point, say, like at the switch and click on it, gives us a little pop-up, and we can literally pick whichever port we want to physically plug into. So we're going to plug just into the first port. And now I've got a cable, a little cable I can drag over here. And so I'm going to come over here and click on the PC1. You'll see it only has one port, of course. So we're going to plug in there. And now we've connected that. You'll see that little dialog popped up that said talking. That's putting that change back in the VM. It's literally connecting, those devices back inside of the VM. So we'll do it again. We'll click on the switch, take another empty port, and we got our cable again. We'll plug it into PC2, and there we go. And then we can come over here and turn this off so we can go back to regular mouse mode. So, okay, cool. That looks cool. We've built a little topology, and I've even used GNS3 when I just needed to throw together a quick network. I didn't go in and configure anything. I just threw out some devices, connected the lines, took a screenshot, made a nice little image. But of course, we want this really to work. So what do we got to do? Well, as I said up here along the top, you have all these buttons that affect the entire project. So we could start all the appliances. We could pause them. We could stop them. But I hardly ever, like I said, I use these buttons over here, a couple, maybe file open, edit, maybe a little bit of view, and then I don't really use anything else because everything in GNS3 has a shortcut menu. So if I just right click on this first PC, you'll see I get all these choices. I could delete it if I didn't like it. I can, go in and configure it. I can do all kinds of stuff. What I'm going to do is just start her up. And you'll see it goes green here as it starts to boot up on my server topology summary over here. It shows me it's firing up as well. So I'm going to do the same thing on the next one. I'm going to right click and tell it to start. And I got both of these running. Now, these are real running devices. They're virtual machines inside of a virtual machine, but they do work. So how do we interact with them? Well, we can use a console, basically a shell prompt. So we're going to right click again and we're going to tell it we want a console. Now it's going to come up and load a terminal for you. If you are just set this all up for this class or shortly before, and you basically have not made any changes, you're going to actually get what's called solar putty. And just for the pure disclosure and record of it, SolarWinds, the company, yes, part of that hack, that company is a big sponsor of GNS3. And so that's why you're getting solar putty. There's nothing wrong with solar putty. The reason I don't use it is because solar putty uses a tabbed approach. So every connection you make is a separate tab. And I prefer to use just putty so that I can have a separate window. So like if I come back over here into GNS3, once again, right click on the second one and tell it console, you can see what I have here. Now I have two different, and I'm a big fan of the Alt tab, so I can just basically put up all of my command prompts and I can have one PC and I can run commands and attacks and do all kinds of things. And when I switch between them. So what are these little virtual PCs? They're really simplistic. They're actually little Linux Docker containers that, and we'll talk more about that later, but they are just simulating a PC. And if you look right here, it says press the question mark to get help. So if we just type in on this one over here on the left, PC1, you'll see that we have all these commands we can run. So we have ARP, we have, echo, we have IP, we have ping, and, a little bit of a trace route, basically, all of these basic commands. And of course, this makes sense. This is a networking tool. So this is just a little bitty client to see if we have networking. So the first thing we're going to do is we got to give, if we're going to have a network, we got to give these things an IP. So I'm just going to use this little IP command to just assign an IP to this machine. So I'm going to just give it, and because that's the way I like to do things, I'm going to pick 10.10. That's what I'm going to give it. 192.168.10.10. So it's going to check out on the network to make sure there's no duplicate devices. It's going to assign that IP. If I come over here and do the same thing, but give this, of course, a different IP, but on the same subnet, so like 10.11, then we basically now have created a little mini network. Now, before I go off and prove that it works, which it will, I want to show you probably one of the slickest things, in my opinion, about GNS3. GNS3, like I said, they call it graphic network simulator. But the reality is that it's not a simulation. If you've ever used something like Cisco Packet Tracer, that's a great program, but it's a simulation. If you try to drag a Cisco appliance into your packet tracer and you go type some really esoteric command from the Cisco manual, you're probably going to get a bad command or file name because nobody wrote the code, the sort of if-then logic to, if you type this, do that. That's a simulation. In the case of GNS3, we're really running little virtual machines, little Docker containers. So these are real emulation. We're not simulating, we're really running them. Now, in this case, this is a simulation, this little thing. But like I said, my favorite part is that it's a real network. Everything kind of works. And so I want to show you something before I even do something as simple as a ping. We're going to show you how real this network is. If you point to, like I showed you earlier, if you point to any one of the devices and right click, you can get a shortcut menu. Well, you can do the same thing on the cables. And if you look, as I mouse over, you see how it turns red there. So that means that now I can right click on that cable and look what it has here. It has start capture. So if we start the capture, and I'm just going to leave the default names, switch Ethernet 0 to PC Ethernet 0, and then start the visualization program. For many of you, this should be a familiar tool. This is going to launch, in our case, Wireshark. But instead of capturing on our Wi-Fi or capturing on our wired network, this is capturing within the virtual network of GNS3. If you happen to not know really much about Wireshark, Wireshark shows you all the packets it captures up here. It then shows you more information about the headers of that packet and then the content down in the bottom pane. So we're capturing on a virtual network and nothing is happening. Okay, why is that? Well, that's one of the things I love about GNS3, because you're creating your own networks, and they're usually not very busy. In this case, we have 2 PCs. They don't really have much to do until we make them talk to each other. But from a training point of view, and even learning, being able to deep dive into what's going on, maybe an attack, looking at packets, etc., you can do anything with this inside of GNS3. So if I do something like this and bring these PCs back over here to the foreground, actually, I just need one. I don't know why I brought both. But I'm going to move this a little bit so you see. So this is PC1. We gave it this 192.168.10.10 IP address. Great. So let's ping the other one, 192.168.10.11. And watch what happens in GNS3. Everything that you should expect. And I'm going to let that run, and then it's only going to do it about 5 times and stop. And then look at the beauty. If you didn't know how this works in networking, as soon as that machine was trying to find the other one, it had to make a decision. Am I pinging something on my own local network? Well, yes. 10.10 is pinging 10.11. They're on the same subnet. So what did it do? The first thing it did was it did an Arp broadcast out here. Who in the heck is 10.11? Tell 10.10. And of course, it's doing that with broadcasting and of course its MAC addresses. And we can look at that information, in here. Look at the MAC addresses, etc. And of course, our 10.11 said, hey, I'm that. I've got this IP. And then the pinging happened. It's a simple little thing, but it's the beauty to me of how GNS3 is really running real networks. And so I've set up exercises in classes before where, for example, maybe you're trying to break into something like Damn Vulnerable and you need to capture the cookie. Well, you can do it with GNS3. Of course, you can do it with burst sweep and other stuff, but you get my point. This is a fully running network. And I'm just going to kill that. I'm not trying to turn this into a Wireshark class or even a networking class. I'm assuming some degree, but this is one of my favorite parts of this. So as you can see, we have a fully running network. And of course, just for argument's sake, I'm going to kill that one and go back to the other one I had just to prove it works the other way, right? We can ping back the other way. Great stuff. All right, cool. Oops, pinging myself. That wasn't really helpful. Ping the chain. All right, there we go. So all of this works. This is very simple. Now, of course, the sad part is, and I'm just going to shut all this down. In this case, I am going to use this big stop button to stop them all. I'm also going to right click on this and stop the capture again. And then just to show you how easy it is, and because this is not what we're going to really do, I'm not going to be, okay, there you go, that's it. Let's switch in a couple of machines. No, we're going to build something a little more elaborate. So I'm just going to select all this, select and drag over it, and then hit delete, and I'm going to delete them all out of my project. So it's that simple to build a little network. Just in a few minutes, we threw together a switch, some cabling, a couple of virtual PCs, and we could ping and trace route and of course packet capture. So, okay, I've proved the GNS3 builds little virtual networks. So how do we really build a cyber range with it? Well, we got to obviously get beyond just a switch or a hub and a couple of machines. We need some real functionality in here. So if we only have these devices, a hub, switch, virtual PC, that's not going to be enough. But if you notice, probably many of you already had, if you look down here at the bottom of this little all devices, pop up, you'll notice the new template. And I'm just going to say, you guys are so lucky if you're just starting out with GNS3. Back when I started years and years ago, we had to do a lot of things by hand, go and download all these individual pieces and be able to get that, imported in. Now they've really made it so much easier to be able to add new devices into GNS3. So we're going to click on this new template button, and then you're going to see one of these cases of, here's another one of those cases. See how it says GNS3 server recommended? Now, if you had a manual one, you had one of these older appliance files, okay, that's sure. And I will show you how to create one in a minute, what they call the manual. That's actually going into edit preferences anyway. So we're going to focus right now, though, just on the ones that are kind of built in and easily addable from the GNS3 server. So we're going to leave that default choice, install the appliance from the GNS3 server. We're going to click next, and then look at these categories. So we have firewalls. Oh, you may even recognize some of this stuff. Okay, pretty cool. We got firewalls. We got guest, just about every flavor of Linux you could imagine, and all kinds of little pre-built devices for scanning and different things. And even you can theoretically put full VMs in here. I'll talk about that very limited at the end. Look at all these routers. Lots of things you may recognize again. Cisco, Juniper, and then of course, last but not least, some switches. Now, you keep seeing Cisco. So I got to stop and address that right there. When we talk about Cisco, it's actually one of the coolest things about GNS3 is that it can truly run a Cisco router in here. But I have to clarify right up front for everybody, you have to have the licenses. You can't just, it's like anything else, right? You got to have the right licenses. So if you work for a Cisco company or you own a Cisco router, then you can take the firmware image and import it into GNS3 and literally be running your router or your switch. And that applies to Juniper and Cisco and all that stuff. But just because it's on this list here is my point being that you can't necessarily just click through this menu and install a Cisco when you don't have the license, you don't have the images. So of course there's lots of open source ones, and that's what we're going to use today. So now you'll notice, though, I want to point a few things out within these lists. You'll see that some of these appliances are listed as QEMU. So these are little QEMU virtual machines. The Dynanips is specifically the ones that are used for Cisco and things like that. And then occasionally for some of these, especially when we go back to guest, for example, you'll see Docker. So, okay, what this comes down to is that's sort of the depth and breadth. In GNS3, we can run all different kinds of virtual machines inside of the VM, VMs inside of VM. And then we can also run Docker appliances. And a lot of them are going to be Docker because Docker is so much more lightweight. And so, and I'll talk more about Docker and sort of some of the last segments of this as we move on. So we have all these different choices. So what are we going to start with? Well, let's start with a router. In my case, I use this one down here called VYOS. I used this years ago. I found it. It's an open source router. You'll probably never find it on hardware out there in the real world, but you will find it in the cloud. It's got images for Azure and Amazon, and it has a little bit of uptake. And it's a cloud router. And it's a great learning router. It's very Cisco-like. If you happen to be a Cisco shop or like Cisco, you'll find that it's very similar. You'll see that it is a QEMU VM. And so to run it, you're going to have to have downloaded some pieces. My setup instructions call for you to go ahead and pre-download some stuff because it makes things easier than trying to do it right in the middle of a live stream class, right? Or like I said, if you're just watching along to right now, you can go back and pre-download this stuff later. But so all you do we're going to pick a router. So I'm going to come here and go, okay, I want to install this router. And it's going to come up. And now you'll notice in my case, there is no other choice, but it is recommending I install it in the GNS3 VM. That's that golden rule of GNS3. Almost all the time, you're going to be installing it in the GNS3 VM. And so then I'm going to come over and it's got a QEM. I have never had to change any of these defaults. If you have some specific piece of equipment that needs some instructions that tells you otherwise, fine. But usually you can just use the defaults. And then this is the screen that confuses people sometimes, because they're seeing all this missing files, and some's green and some's red, and what's going on? Well, if you look really close, you'll see that one of them here in the middle says ready to install. And if we expand that, that's because it found both the ISO and it found this empty 8G file, which is really just a virtual hard drive. Like I said, this is a real little micro VM. And so when you install it into GNS3, it has its own little virtual hard drive, so you can do the installation. It has a live CD, and you need both of those. Now, if, for example, you didn't already pre-download, so it's saying missing everything, then when you click on one of these, like missing, if we wanted to get this 117, you'll see it says missing. We can click the download button here, and it'll open up a web browser and take us over to that page so we can download that needed ISO. Same for this empty 8G file, even though in my case, and I'll show you that, I've already downloaded them. So there it is right there. It's already pre-downloaded. If you had followed the instructions, then you would have had these two. You can see I've done these a few times. And so they're just, all you have to do is just leave them in your download folder, and then of course it'll find both pieces. Perfect. And of course that was collapsed, and then I just have to click on that line. Now you'll notice the downloads go away because I got everything I need. I'm good to go. And all I have to do at that point is just click next, and it says, are you sure you want to install this? Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, it says, okay, it's going to show up over in the category, and you'll notice it says the username and password is VYLS. We'll come back to this a little bit later. So I'm just going to click finish, and it says, hey, good job, you got it over there. And so you can do that with any virtual machine within the GNS3 set of software choices, appliance choices, I guess is the better phrase. So, okay, cool. Now we've added a router we can play with. Let's go back and get some other stuff. We could keep using this switch, and it's nothing wrong with the switch that comes with GNS3, but I actually prefer another one called Open vSwitch. So we're going to go get that one. And the reason I like it is because it's a little more full featured. It's programmable. You can set up network port mirroring, all kinds of cool stuff, which comes in handy if you want to do like an intrusion detection in your topology, because you can set up port mirroring and capture. And I'll show you some of that very briefly later. So in this case, we're going to come down here to the last choice for switches and scroll down here to this Open vSwitch. You'll notice there's two of them. One's just the normal one. That's the one I'm going to use. The one that says with management, it actually has a port that you can SSH within your topology and manage it. Since we can just open up a terminal via console, I'm not going to worry about the management version. I'm just going to stick this in. It says install it to the VM, no choice. That's what we want anyway. And then it's just going to show up on the side. Now, that was much quicker, right? Because we didn't have to pre-download those pieces. Now, I will say this, though. If this is your first time adding a Docker appliance into your topology, into your thing, the first time you try to drag it over, down here in this bottom area, you're going to see what's called a Docker pull. It's going to go off and pull all the stuff it needs to actually run that little Docker container. Or if you, once again, were following the instructions, then you actually logged into the GNS3 VM and ran some Docker pull commands to go ahead and preload this stuff. Which once again speeds things up. Either way works. Just be prepared if you're doing loading things for the first time. They can take a little while to download all the pieces. So okay, we got a router, we got a switch. What else do we need? Well, you know, that little virtual PC was cool, but it's kind of limited. Let's get something that's a better client. So I'm going to go in here to guest, and then I'm going to scroll down, and I have this. There was one I'm looking for right there. Ubuntu Docker guest. So this is, once again, we can put a full Ubuntu VM in here, but that's going to be a little heavier. And so with this Docker guest, we can have a much more lightweight Docker client. And it's also fairly easy to install. Once again, the GNS3 VM, finish, and boom. So now I've added another one to my menu. So now I got router, I got a switch, you know, all kinds of cool things that we can do with that. So even just with this, we can start to build a little bit more of an elaborate network, right? Now, instead of just having a switch and a couple of virtual PCs, we can really begin to start to build sort of the backbone of a network. Now, I'm going to do a little disclaimer here. I'm going to cheat a little bit for the course of today. I have, I think now, about 45 minutes left, so give us a little time for questions in Discord and to make sure there's some transition between the next segments. And so I want to make sure I get everything covered today. So I'm going to start, and we're going to kind of cheat a little bit. And this is something that I do to build more simple ranges. You can build them as realistic as you want, folks. And I want to try to get you the basics here so you can run with it from there. But when I build one of these, I always cheat. And what I mean by cheat is I decide, and it's something I've done in every topology now that I build, it's my thing. You probably, most of you here, if you're in this class wanting to learn how to build one of these, know a little bit about networking, know about IP, right? So with IP4, we have, so many billions of, of IP addresses, and we have certain blocks that are reserved as non-routable, right? The ones we use inside of our house or our office, like the 192.168s, right? Or the 172s, or the 10 range. Well, I like that 10 range. Very few people use the 10.x.x.x range. So I like to use it when I'm building a fake topology. And what I do is I pretend that the entire 10 is the internet. So you'll see that when I'm about to build for you and show you. You can do anything you want to, by the way. It's your network that you're building here. But this, I'm going to build this in the interest of time and just using what I've done before in my model. And so usually what I end up doing is I say, okay, the entire internet is 10xxx. And then I decide that the outside is going to be 10.1.1, whatever. And then I decide that my company is going to be 10.10.10.10 or something. And I can set up any way I want to using that kind of methodology. As long as I'm internally consistent with my IP assignments and gateways and things, it'll work, right? It's a little bit of a cheat, as you'll see, but it gets the job done for me to start simulating the ability to have sort of an outside, an inside, a DMZ, whatever I want to. So, okay, what are we going to start with? Well, we're going to start with our router. I'm going to drag me a router in. And, just because I can, in this case, I will just rename this. I don't like the DYOS 1.8.-1. So we'll just call it router. Okay, there we go. So we got a router in our network now. That's cool. And then we're going to cheat a little bit. We're going to throw in a couple switches on each side of the router. And like I said, if you were playing along live and you hadn't preloaded the stuff, the first time you dragged one of these switches in, all of this downloading happens down here in the bottom. Don't freak out. That's what's supposed to happen. I've already pre-downloaded all this, so I don't have to worry about that. And so I'm going to go ahead and wire some of this stuff up. We'll see that our router has 3 Ethernet ports. So I'm going to leave, theoretically, I'm going to leave one alone. Maybe that could be another, pathway. I'm going to just use one to come over here to switch one, plug that in. I'm going to have 2 come over here to switch 2, plug that in. All right, cool. Both of those are up and running. And so what I'm doing, like I said, I'm cheating a bit. I'm creating a switch that's going to be kind of my outside, if you will, for simple purposes. We can do a little bit of labeling there too. If you're inclined to do so, we could say this is either like LAN or DMZ or whatever we want. Let's just do that, right? Okay, so we're faking here a little bit, but because we're tying, 2 sides with one router, but you kind of get my point, I think. You can build it as elaborate as you want. And so then if we want to, actually have some devices again, we can do something like this. So we can drag, say, one of these Docker guests, out here. I'm going to go, I'm just going to call this guest because this is going to be my outside machine. So a little bit of editing there. Okay, so then, and then I don't know, I'll actually throw one in here just for giggles. So this is just we're just going to cheat a bit and call it server. It's not really, but you get my idea. I'll show you some better things to add in. And then, of course, we can wire all these guys in. All right, let's plug this one into the switch. And admittedly, once again, I admit this is a little bit of a simulation cheat that I am pretending that the outside is a switch, right? And I'm plugging in something in and I'm signing it. All right, so we built this little network. Now, of course, the reality is, though, just sort of like the previous one we built, none of this is going to work until we do a little bit of configuration. So now, also, I want to show you something. This is actually one of the slowest pieces when you have a real VM in here, not just a Docker container. The Docker containers boot up like that. But a real virtual machine is going to take a little while to boot. So we're going to go ahead and right-click on the router and tell it to start, and then give it a second, and then right-click again and choose console. And then what we're going to do is we should see this router start to boot up for us. There we go. Perfect. It's booting up. Now, you'll notice that one of the things it says to start the installation, log in and use the command install image. Or if we come over here and just point to the router for a second, you'll see down here at the bottom it says default username and password, VYOS. At the first boot, it starts from a CD, starts from that live image. So you have to do install system. So I'm not going to do that, once again, in the interest of time today in our lab so I can get everything done. But if you really are going to build yourself a range, and maybe you're going to build a range that you're going to share with somebody, maybe your friends or your colleagues, or you're going to build your own capture the flag for the next Red Team Village event and be part of that. Help us out, join the group, whatever. And you're going to share it with your students, as the case may be. If you want to do that installation step, because like I said, this is a real virtual machine. Right now, it's literally booting off of that ISO, that CD, that live image. And it's going to work. So when I go in here, I'm going to show you how to configure IPs. We'll make this whole little network work. But if we shut it down and restart it, it won't be there. So in an ideal world, you would want to run that install system. What it does is it installs the VYOS off of that CD to the actual hard drive that's in that little 8G, empty 8G file in there. And that way, then you can save your settings, and every time you bring back up this project, it'll have its IPs configured. And if you started defining firewalls and other stuff, which is a little more advanced than we're going to get to today, but it's something you can do, right, to make a more realistic range. But one of the reasons I always do this is because it does take a while to boot up the virtual machine. I like to go ahead and get it booted and get it booting, and then we can go work on some other stuff, right, while that continues to boot in the background. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to right click on my switches and go ahead and start them up. I don't have any need to go into them with a console right now. That I could. They're 8-port switches right out of the box, so to speak. The thing I like about them is they are a Linux distribution. A Linux application, basically, sort of like VYOS. They're custom Linux, setups to be routers, to be switches, and they've got some really nice functionality. And I'll show you in another topology near the end how that works, at least high level. But the Open vSwitch supports the ability to do port mirroring and build bridges and all kinds of cool things. And so that's why I prefer to add it into my topologies than just that default GNS3 switch. It can do VLANs and all that stuff too. So then, of course, we have these 2 Docker containers. Okay, but we got to get them on the network. Now, remember with that virtual PC, these little guys, we went ahead and booted them up, and then we ran a command inside to configure them. And the reality is, because these Docker containers are little Docker Linux, virtual machines, containers, you can boot them up and go in and edit the etc network interfaces file and change it that way. But thankfully, in many cases, you can actually do it this way, because GNS3 has made it a little easy for you. So you can right click and actually choose configure. Okay, cool. So what's going on here? Look at the bottom, it says network configuration with a big old edit button. If you click on that, that actually brings up the etc network interfaces file. That's actually the file in that little container. You're editing it live. So you can do it with the machine, with the VM, the appliance booted, or you can do it, standalone outside. And so in our case, we're going to use a static IP in this case. So I'm just going to take out these comments, and then I'll have to edit it appropriately. I'm not going to worry about name service. You can set up name service inside of GNS3. I usually don't. I usually just do things by IP. It makes it easier to build the network. And so in this case, like I said, I pretend that the entire internet is 10. So I'm going to say this is 10.1.1. Just 100, whatever. And then I'm going to have to, I'm cheating a bit. Oh, I promise. I told you that. I admitted it. So I'm going to cheat right here is my biggest cheat. I'm going to say the gateway is 10.1.1. So what am I going to do? I'm going to configure that router's interface to be 10.1.1. It's a little bit of a cheat, but it works. So I'm going to save that one. All right, cool. And then I'm going to apply. We should see a little pop-up probably, and sometimes it's for the server. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to, of course, come over here to this other one, right-click on the server. It's a pretend server at the moment. We'll add some other cool stuff here in a bit. But I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to configure this one. All right, cool. I'm going to edit this etc network interfaces file again. And in this case, I'm going to pretend that our company got assigned the 10.10.10 range. It's my usual model. And we'll just call this server 100. It's kind of a fake. It's not. We'll just give it that IP. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. And then we'll say 10.10.1. So that's my cheat there, is the gateway trick. I'm only going to use one router in our short little example. I'll show you a little more complex example beyond that in a second. All right, so those are both there. Let's check on our router. Let's see how it's doing. Oh, we got to the login. Okay, so it's up. So the router's up. All right, so let's go ahead and start up our other machines. And of course, at that point, if I was to bring up a console here on this machine, we can do a little say like if config, and we can see, yeah, look, there it is. There's the IP address we assigned. If you want to see this, we can do it this way too. So there is that file. So like I said, it's kind of a neat little trick that GNS3 for most Docker containers lets you do that right click and configure, so you don't necessarily have to come in here and use Nano or Pico or something, or VI or whatever you want to use to edit that file manually. But that works. If you know how to do it at the command prompt of Linux, you can do it in here. These are running machines. So this is a machine, but of course, if I try to ping that 10.10.10. What did I call it, 100? We're not going to get anywhere, right? Because the problem is we don't have a gateway, destination net unreachable. And that's because we haven't configured this router. If we added more, things just to the switch, then we'd have a standalone switch network, and we could ping those if they're on the same subnet. But we got to set up at least some basic functionality of our router, at least give it some IPs if we want it to work for us. So, like I said, in reality, if we were going to really be keeping this, and if I had more time, I would do it for you anyway. We would want to run this install image command here. We want to actually do that installation. If you run it on your copy, then it's going to load the software from that live CD that we booted to, and it's going to put it on the hard drive so you can save settings, you can save your configurations, etc. Worst case, this is not too bad if I have to repeat it again. And so I'm just going to log in here with VYLS and VYLS, and it's going to then come into a prompt. And like I said, this router, I'm not going to try to teach you in this class in the time we have left to make you a VYLS expert, but I want to show you at least how to do a simple little configuration and some basic functionality of it. And if you want more, go to the VYLS website, and there's all kinds of great information on their router there. And so, but much like Cisco, VYLS routers have two, there's two modes. It sort of has its operational mode, which is what we're in now. So that we can do things like this. We can do show interfaces. And what we're going to see is there's three interfaces. They're up, but they're not configured. Okay, we got to figure that out. And you'll notice that I plugged them in a little different this time. I plugged ETH1 out to the outside, ETH2 to our DMZ in this case. So I'll have to keep that in mind when I configure this. And so this is where you do all of the just monitoring. Yeah. One of the things that's kind of cool, like if we do a show, we just type show and hit tab a couple times, it's going to show us all the things we can run with the show command. So it's got built-in tab completion, built-in help. So like I said, I'm not trying to, turn you, hit Q there to quit out of that. I'm not trying to turn you into a VYLS expert, but I want you to understand the basics of it. And then, of course, just like Cisco has its enable mode, which is really the admin mode where you get in there and do some real work, right? And configure things. We have the configure mode. So if we type configure into our VYLS router, we can come in here, and now you see our prompt changes from the $sign to the hashtag or pound sign. And now we're in the administrative mode, or the configuration mode, so that we can begin to configure this router. So we only need to know a couple things, and I've actually cheated. I've got it right here so I can show it to you folks, and then I'll modify. But so the basic things you have to do in VYLS to configure an interface is you have to, one, go into configure mode, and then there are two commands, these set commands. Now, the one thing I got to do a little different in this case today is I did things a little different, but this is actually a 1 because of the fact I changed it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cheat and I'm going to copy this. You can type it in, of course. I'll do it that way. Set. See, we can do set interfaces and tab completion, right? So it's easy enough. Ethernet, ETH1, right? Oops. What are you doing? Oops, my bad. Uh-oh, I see it's trying to give me help and I didn't want help. So, okay. So then, oops. And all I'm doing is assigning this IP, giving it a /24. And then the beauty is, and this time I'll cut and paste, but the beauty is, just because most of you should know this for Linux and command lines already, right? But you can use the up arrow. So we can cheat for our second router. So our second interface, I mean. So what we've done here is we've set the interface for the outside one to 10.1.1.1, and we've given it a name. Now the name is required. You need the 2 lines, set the address and set the description. And the reason for that is because later, if you're configuring firewalls or other types of stuff like that, even DHCP, this router can do a lot of things. Actually, VPN, SSH, pretty cool little router. Sometimes you use those names to tie things together. So now to finish the other side, then we have to sort of cheat a little bit. So we're going to come back and say, okay, we want to make the second interface or the third interface. And you see, I'm just using the up arrow and I'm editing away here so that I can apply that change. And then I'm going to cheat a little bit. So, you folks, if you didn't know these tricks, right? This is the Linux system admins, hackers, crackers. We're all lazy, so we like to be able to minimize the number of keystrokes we do. And so that's minimalistically what you have to do to set up one of these routers. You've got to go in and assign your IPs. And then at that point, you can do, drawing a blank. So I know I want to save it. Okay, we got to commit. Commit those changes. And then we can save it. Now, in my case, like I said, if we save this, it's not going to work. If we reboot this project, shut it down, restart it, and not just reboot the router in here, but if we literally, at this point, if we were to stop all this and close DNS3, shut it down and bring it back up, then we're going to have to reconfigure that router. Why? Because we didn't do that install system command. If you do that, then the settings will stay. If otherwise, you'll just have to quickly reapply. And as you can see, you can cut and paste and make a little notepad about it or whatever you want to do. So now that we've done that, though, let's take a look at this. If we were to just come over here and hit the up arrow and try to ping across our network, we now have a functioning, well, we should have a functioning network. It's not working yet. Packet loss. Well, we got a little troubleshooting to do. Let's try this. So let's see. Ping. We can ping our gateway. Cool. All right. Did I mess something up in my line? Probably. Unreachable. So what did I do? Let's go back to the router. Cool. No, 10.10.10.1. That should be right. Well, let's take a look. What did I do? So let's get out of the. Let's get out of this. There we go. I'm going to exit out of the configuration mode. Let's do show interfaces. Let's see what happens. Well, that looks like that should be working. Maybe it's just taking a second to. So, like if I ping 10.1.1.1, I can ping out that way. If I ping 10.100, I get to ping out that way. Okay, so I'm not sure what's going on there. What did I do wrong here? Oh, I see. I can't type today. There we go. All right, there we go. I see what I did wrong. That should now ping for us. Okay. What am I typing wrong here? Anyway, I think you guys get the point. And given my time constraints, I'm going to have to move on. So we configured the router. Sorry about that. I see I typed a 19. I should have my reading glasses on in all honesty, but I don't want to at the moment. Anyway, all right. So, okay, we've gone a little further now. We've gone beyond just building a couple virtual PCs that can ping each other with a switch. And now we have begun to build the simulations of, a complete network. We have routers, and we could have more than one routers. We can set multiple routers together. We can set up, open source path first or WIP protocols. We can do BGP. You can do anything you want to. That's the whole thing I love about this, is that you really do have the ability to build out very elaborate networks so that you can build a very holistic range. Now, the one thing, though, is we've got to take a little look at, there's got to be some other things here, right? Here we are, we've got routers, we've got switches, we've got clients, but what about, this is a holistic cyber range. What about targets? What about attack and crack things and different types of tools, right? Well, thankfully, there are a few things that are in the Kali Linux. Shouldn't say in the Kali, in the GNS3. They have built, for example, a little command line Kali Linux appliance, which is really cool because it has things like Hydra and, of course, Nmap and Metasploit and things like that. So you can add that in. You can also go out and add things from other resources. And I'll go through at the very end some of those other resources, particularly some of the other kind of marketplace things that are out there. But one of the things I wanted to talk real briefly about here and show you how to add, it was one of the things that are in the instructions for sort of pre-setting up, is when I got into GNS3 many years ago, and while things have improved quite a bit in the last few years, it's much easier now to import new templates and add new appliances. It still is so focused on networking, not as much on security, but there's only so many products there. Sure, there's firewalls, there's intrusion detection, there's certain things, but there were certain things that I wanted as part of teaching, both where I work and for CompTIA and others, teaching people cybersecurity. I wanted other appliances, other things. And so actually, I got into Docker for that very reason. Because one of the things that, on top of all the cool things already about how you can build a real network that works and you can packet trace and you can do all packet capture and do all this stuff, is that if you want something inside of GNS3 and you can't find it out there already existing, then go build it yourself in Docker. And so I got into building, and I'm going to actually just do this real fast. I'm going to bring up a page. So I want to show you this. I'm going to follow us. So then we've got, so many of you probably know about GitHub, which is the source code repository. Well, Docker has Docker Hub, basically. And this is a repository for Docker containers. And so this is my Docker container library. And I've built a bunch of different Docker containers. They're all open source. They're all public. You're more than welcome to use any of them in your project. Some of them I had you pre-download or that are part of the instructions. And so like I have a Snort appliance. I have one that has Snort and DarkStat, which is kind of a monitoring tool. A lot of ones I just play with. This Net Defense has OpenBoss and a bunch of other stuff on there. There's Damn Vulnerable. And then one I'm most proud of is Metasploitable, so that you can actually have some targets in your system. And the truth of the matter is, like, do you want maybe a Microsoft, a MySQL database? And you can find anything. Now, I will be honest, not everything you find in Docker will work in GNS3. Some of the things that I built in my library, I specifically had to kind of tweak them, hack them a little bit, if you will, to, like, I found somebody built a version of Metasploitable for Docker, but nothing started, nothing worked. And so I took that as a base and then, fixed it. And now it's, as you can see by the number of downloads, it's kind of taken off. And I'm really proud of that. And lots of people use it in their either Docker testing environments or their GNS3 environments. So if you are looking to add something else in, then one of the things is that that's where, if you look right here, it says add a manual template. And then look what happens when you click next. It actually just brings up the edit preferences screen here. So that's why I said I would come back to this, edit preferences. And then it's basically putting itself down here. If you're going to create a custom, so you see the ones that I've already added. I added them through the menus and they're over here, Open vSwitch, Ubuntu, whatever. But if you want to add one that's not in the list, so for example, sadly, even though I guess maybe I could submit, but if I go here to the standard list, you know, and I go looking, I'm not going to find, you know, there's no Metasploit here. How do I add these Metasploit? I want Metasploit in my project. I want to attack some stuff. Well, all you have to do is do this manual. So either do the manual here, or just go to edit preferences and to Docker containers. Either way. And then at that point, you can say, I want to add a new one. So once again, as always, what do we see? That's the rule of one thing you've learned today, always run everything in the GNS3 VM, right? So, okay, cool. So we're going to do that. And then you'll notice it says either use an existing image or a new image. If you were doing it totally new, then you would be over there on Docker Hub and you would get the like Lee Jr. / Metasploitable or whatever it is, and you would fill that in, and then you could move through the process of adding a brand new Docker container into your thing. If you followed the instructions or got them and you downloaded them, you're going to see that you're going to have this drop down under existing. So a lot of this stuff, so like there's my Metasploitable, but that's what you would type in, Lee Jr. / Metasploitable 2 : latest, if you were doing a new image, okay? So that's all it is. You just basically, it's what's called a Docker pull path. You're just going to include that in. Now, there'll be a few questions. You can change it. Like, you know, maybe you don't want it to show up on your menus as Lee Jr. You want it just to be Metasploitable 2. You can fix that. If you needed to have more than one adapter, many times, like if you're going to add a snort appliance in and you're going to set up intrusion detection and you want it to be inline, then you're going to need to have 2 adapters, right? So the traffic can pass through and you'll have to configure that, but that's doable. I'm just going to leave one. This is just a target. Don't have any start commands. If the Docker instructions say to do so, then fine. Otherwise, you don't usually have to. Usually the console type is telnet, right? A shell, just opening up bash basically. If it's a GUI, like, and some of them are, then you may have a VNC instead so that you can connect to it with a virtual network and get a desktop. And then I've never had to put any environment variables in. If you do, that's great. That's cool. Now you've added it, right? So if we click apply, we should see it pops over there on our list. And so now we can add Metasploitable into this bad boy. All right, let's throw ourselves a Metasploitable in here. Let's wire that thing up. Whatever port. And there you go. And of course, we can once again either right click here and choose configure and edit that file. We can boot it up, go into it and edit, give it an IP, get it on our network, and you know, and get it rocking along. So for example, I guess just to be consistent, edit the network. And once again, we'll just do a little bit of editing here. And since this one's out here on this side, we'll call it just 10. That's easier. Anyway, once again, if you don't like my 10-10-10 trick, you're more than welcome to come up with whatever IPing scheme you want to. You obviously have to follow the rules. It has to be internally consistent. But then, of course, you know, we can fire this thing up and get ourselves a console on it. And you'll see it starts loading up stuff. This one takes a little bit longer to boot because it's loaded. I will say this about this one since I built it. There are, if you were to use this Metasploitable appliance and you basically are working through with some Metasploitable guide, for example, and you're trying to crack and beat all the challenges, you're going to run into a few guys and girls that don't work. And I'm going to be honest, I have to be honest. The reason for that is there's a handful, like, I don't know, 2 to 4 or something like that of the various hacks in Metasploitable 2 that are actually dependent upon old kernel bugs. And so those don't work in this one because this is actually running off a slightly newer version of Ubuntu as a Docker container. But all of the other things work. And so you can see it starts up all this stuff, right? And, so you can port scan this thing, you can start attacking it. If you put one of the web terms in, you can surf over inside of this topology. And so, I'm hoping that you're beginning to get the idea of, how elaborate of a system, we can build. And so, and we could just keep going on and on. We can add intrusion detection. We can add OpenBOS. We can add monitoring softwares. One of the things I did a number of years ago, pre-COVID, I was doing a con with CompTIA, and they asked me to build a topology and to show some blue team techniques within GNS3. And so that's why I built that dark stat monitoring tool. I used a couple other ones. And then many of you may be familiar with Alien Vault's OSSIM, right? Their SIM. I couldn't get it to run inside of GNS3 as a container. It was just too intensive. But what I was able to do is literally just build it as a VM, as a true VirtualBox VM. And then, even though I'm not going to go into great detail about that, I was able to come in here and literally add that VM into this, just like we added those Docker containers. And now it's an object I can drag it in and tie it in. And it was a pretty cool little demo to be able to use a true. And so that standalone VM was tied in and was monitoring that network, and I had all this traffic going on. And so you can do red team, you can do blue team. One of my favorite things to folks, just for argument's sake, is so like this meta exploitable, right? So maybe you come over here in your log directories, you take a look at, maybe you're going to attack MySQL, maybe you're going to just try to log in, right? Look at the auth log, maybe do a tail of something, and then basically go off and start attacking this machine. Watch the web logs, for example, and have that, just rolling in the background. This is how I teach many of my students in say like more intermediate classes. We'll have machine terminal over here, and then we might have another machine, a terminal like this guest terminal over here. And let's pretend that was more than just an Ubuntu, but we're basically running attacks and scans, and we're watching it in real time happen on the other. Maybe we've even got packet, Wireshark up so that we can watch the packets go by. And so there's just so many things that you can, because you're running a real network here. The limitations are really up to you, folks. It's up to your imagination. How complex of a network do you want to build? And of course, be aware, as you get into building these and they get more and more intense, you might need to change the defaults. By default, the GNS3 VM only has, I think, maybe 2 CPUs and a gig or 2 of RAM. You can crank that up if you have more to help your simulations run better, right? And so let me see here. Let me check one thing. Step in 1 second, bear with me. That's what I thought. Okay, so I'm looking at my time here. Okay, let me show you a few more things. Okay, so this, I think, now gives you the idea, all of you, of how that you can build out. So let's take a look at a slightly more complex topology, just as an idea. So I mentioned in the beginning, I'm CTO for Coverage 6, and we're a training services and products company in all aspects of security. One of the things we do is we have the Department of Labor National Program Standard for Cybersecurity Training. And so as part of our program, we built this topology. This is our lab environment for our classes. And so I'm going to bring this up, take a second to load. Now, that other project that I made, it shut everything down and saves it back to the VM. There is no save in GNS3. As a matter of fact, that's something I forgot to point out. There's only an open and a save as. There is no save. As soon as you make changes in GNS3, those changes are happening. But now that you guys see this, I think you'll begin to see kind of the idea of how far you can take this. I'm still using my cheat. This is everything is the 10 network, right? So the outside here is all 10, 1, 1, 1, whatever. And then the DMZ is 10, 10, 10, 10. And then this is actually a separate router, right? We're using RIP between these two. And this router is running DHCP and is actually assigning out 192.168 addresses to this virtual LAN. And, this thing comes to our students when we start in our intermediate class, our intro class. It's wide open. You can ping everything from everywhere. And it's just totally wide open. But of course, over the course of our program, we then show them how to set up firewalls, right? And firewall rules. We can, and then so we start off early on, we maybe ran an open boss against Meta. It's come up with this huge report with all these vulnerabilities, of course, that Meta has. And then, of course, we put some firewall rules in place. We run those types of scans and attacks again and show, obviously certain things aren't accessible anymore. And then can we get past some of those things as we move to our intermediate and later our advanced classes? So, and we could take this, some of the ones, if you ever go out to the GNS3 site, oh my gosh, some of the things out there are just pretty amazing. Some of the topologies you can build. And let me get back on this page. So as you can see, this basically is showing a simulated outside, a simulated DMZ, a simulated LAN, and you can build them as deep as you want to. And of course, all of this is configurable. These Dmz monitoring, these are my those snort appliances. And they're basically plugged into the switches on a port that has port mirroring enabled, so that we can capture, and that's something that, once again, you got to go to the Open vSwitch site, and there's some examples of how to set up port mirroring. But it's really cool because now I can set up port mirroring, and then any attacks that go across to any of those servers can be captured by that snort, and then we can teach writing snort rules or anything else we want to do as part of this. And of course, if you can build whatever type of topology you want to. All right, so let me do this. I am going to, just for the moment, well, I guess to take you through the entire thing. Like I said, there is no save. There's only a save as. You have to think of GNS3 as more like a database. It's not like Word where you open up and you type everything in memory and then save down. This is more like a database. As soon as you make a change to a record, it updates the database. As soon as if I was to delete one of these nodes, it would instantly save that back to the VM. So be aware that if you're wanting to make a copy of something, build it out and then do a save as before you start messing with stuff. Now, that also leads to one other little trick. Probably besides booting up like the router, which takes a few minutes compared to just the VMs, the Docker containers that boot up real fast. The routers take a little more. Probably the two slowest things you can possibly do in GNS3 is right here, either exporting a project or importing a project. And it's one of my things, and I won't get off on my pet peeve about how I hate status bars, and people don't do them very well in programming. But if you go to import a project, and when you do so, it's going to show like a status bar across the screen, and then it's going to start looping and looping and looping and looping and looping, and it doesn't give you any other good feedback. All I'm going to do is say, wait for it, folks. If you ever import a project, like if I'm going to take this one that we that we built a little while ago, and I'll export it and post it and put it out in the drive in case somebody wants to download it and have something already built to start with. But it's just going to take forever, and it's really but that's because it's going to do that first read of reading in the container, or reading in the project file, and then it has to send everything back to the VM and set it all up. So that takes a while. So that's why that loop. Don't cancel out. Just let it happen. Sooner or later, poof, everything will appear. So one of the reasons I got to, just as a follow-on point here, that I love GNS3 is that, think about, if I was to build this as standalone VMs and try to give this to you, what do we got here? 15 nodes. Let's just imagine that each of these was only a gigabyte of size, like minimal Linux installs, and they're not super big, a little bit of space to grow. This would be 15 gigabytes, right? But take a look at this. This is actually how big, and I'm going to go to the desktop, this to our student folder, and to this project. This is the project. You see this right here? This 15 node network that we give our students in our program is less than a gigabyte for all of that. Now, there's some more stuff it'll download, and some of the Docker and stuff too, I admit. But still, if I tried to build this as standalone VMs, I'd be looking at 7, 10, 15. If it was Windows machines, God forbid, hit 30, 40, 50 gigs, right? Every VM is, 10 gigs. So this is one of the things I love about using GNS3 and Docker to build these really elaborate cyber ranges, but have them actually still be fairly small from the point of view of size. All right. So, okay, so we've built a range, we've played around, and when you're done, at the end of the day, all you got to do is this. Just tell it you want to exit, and it'll shut down everything if it was loaded. We'll watch that even our VM in the background will go away automatically after a couple of moments here as it does what it needs to do to close everything out. And you'll see it's just taking a moment. You got it not responding, but that's talking to the local server. That's not an error, I promise. It's open source. What can you say, right? And then a second here, come on. I'm pushing my system and streaming and everything else, I guess. We're going to shut down, right? There we go. Boom. And that's where we get to. And now we're done. So let me do this. Let me return very shortly to here, to our slides. Start from current stuff. Because I said we had a few more things to cover. I told you this is probably one of the smallest slide decks in the whole con. It usually is. But I want to point out some other resources for you. Okay. So I showed you hub.dockercom. I showed you mine, but there's also the GNS3 one. I didn't show that to you today, but you'll definitely want to take a look at that and be able to add some additional things. One of my favorite ones that they've already built, I would say, are two. One is WebTerm. WebTerm is a little Docker Linux distro with a web browser. So it has Firefox in it, and it uses VNC. And so you literally can open that up, right-click, choose console, and you've got a browser, and you're surfing within the environment. It's really sweet, especially for web attacks and web pen testing. They also have the Kali Linux command line Docker container they built, which has the basics, Hydra, Metasploit, and map, on and on and on. Doesn't obviously have a GUI, it's a command line only. And then you can just go to the GNS3 site. And this I will do real fast because let me just fire up another browser real quickly. Because GNS3 really should take a look at. There's the marketplace right there. You're going to want to come over to the GNS3 marketplace, take a look occasionally. Sometimes things will come out here. And like I said, this is some standard tools. This is not the tools that were hacked. You don't have to install any of their stuff. They're just a sponsor. But you can see there's a lot of stuff that they have. Most of it's like the Ubuntu desktop or Docker guest. They're all, most of them are on that menu. But occasionally something will come out here that's not available through the appliance yet, and through the actual software. So you can just see all these different things, and there's more and more that you can do. I really recommend you just check out the GNS3 site. You're going to have to make yourself an account and then join the community even, because there's just all kinds of great discussion out here. You can find samples of really cool topologies people have built. Every once in a while, they'll have a contest, and it's pretty amazing some of the ones that people build in that capacity. So you want to use Docker. Like I said, any Docker technically can go out there and be used in the context of GNS3, but there's sometimes where they don't quite work. So one of the things that, and I've been threatening this for almost a year, but maybe I'll have to just do another class someday that's just Docker for GNS3. But what I did, just in a nutshell, is I created a separate virtual machine and installed Docker and set up all my Docker and got into figuring out and learning how to build Docker appliances. And the reason is because I wanted those functionality. I wanted OpenBOS, I wanted Snort, I wanted various things inside of GNS3 so I could build these ranges. And so you're, of course, more than welcome to use any of those in my hub. But, of course, feel free to build your own as well. Now, this is that. Take a picture of this. Take a screenshot on your computer right now. You see this long link. Sorry about it, folks. But this is the link that is to a summary document in my Google Drive for this con, for this Red Team Village training. And it has a link to the slides, which are already up there, a link to the instruction document, and it will also have a link to this project file probably later today. I'll export that up and put that in there. And then when this is all done, and I assume this individual video gets placed as a video in the playlist, I'll put a link to it as well so that everything's kind of together nicely within that document. So that is the URL. I'm going to leave it up just for a moment longer here so that you folks can take a screenshot, take a picture, and etc. All right, so if you have that one, then even now, if you're watching this video 6 months from now, I'll keep that page up. You should be able to get to all this material. So that is all I have for you today, folks. We've gone about an hour and a half. We've got about 15 minutes, give or take, to the next session. I want to thank you all for attending. I see a lot of people streaming on YouTube. I don't even know how many on Twitch or other channels. So it's always exciting to talk to so many people. And it's always a pleasure to work with the Red Team Village and Omar and Cedric and team. If you have any questions, lee.grayhat@gmail. Drop me an email anytime. Happy to help answer questions, especially if you're trying to get GNS3 set up or you're doing something kind of fun and something new. I'd love to help people out building these ranges. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the day of cool workshops and training sessions.